Secretary Walsh, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. You have an awful lot on your plate dealing with the labor market overall. And I want to go through exactly where we are, where we're headed. But given what's going on right now in the world, I want to start with the basic question, the Ukraine crisis. It's on everybody's mind right now. As you sit there now in Washington, do you think that is likely to affect the labor market in material effects or not?
I think to some degree it potentially will. Obviously, the longer it goes on, the longer the war goes on, the more complicated it is. I mean, there are products that are exported out of Ukraine that will impact us as a world, and certainly oil in Russia is going to impact us as well. Most of the Western world has, I think, refused or stopped importing of oil to countries. So that's going to have impacts. I mean, when you think about the economy, it is a global economy. So there will be impacts at some point along the way. Certainly it just adds to what we've been living with over the last 2 years with the pandemic. And this is a worldwide problem. It's not just the United States problem. It's a worldwide problem. So what impacts one part of the world will eventually impact all the world.
What about the economy more broadly? We obviously have had unemployment going down fairly steadily here, a lot of job creation. How much is that tied into GDP growth and possible effects on really reducing some of the growth because of the conflict?
Well, it's great. It's certainly, seeing the unemployment come down is good. We're not fully back to where we were pre-pandemic levels, but we have other factors going on now. We have inflation that we're working on, and policies for inflation. We're seeing rising gas prices. Again, we have to work on bringing those costs down. So I think over the next several months here in the United States, there's going to be a lot of action, hopefully, by the president and by obviously my department and Commerce and the rest of us working hard to bring costs down. So there's still a lot of unanswered. There's still a lot of questions that we have to wait to get answers on as we move forward here.
Before we answer some of the questions coming up, give us your sense of a snapshot of right now where we are in the labor markets. You're a little bit more than a year into the Biden administration. How would you describe the state of the labor market right now? What do you like about it? What are you not quite so satisfied about?
Well, I think we first of all, we have a strong labor market. When you think about 7.4 million people returning back to work, unemployment at 3.8%, those numbers are good numbers. We probably have about 3 million people that we still want to get back into the workforce as we move forward here. I think what I like to see is in last month's job report, we saw people with less than a high school education, lowest unemployment rate since 1992 when we started counting it. So that shows you that people are going back to work. Areas that I'd like to see more improvement in are certainly getting more women back into the workforce, more African-American women back into the workforce. Some of those issues and challenges that women have is lack of good, strong childcare. And there's still a fear of the pandemic out there that we have. I think we have a real opportunity here in the government. The president is pushing legislation for childcare. We are certainly working here at the Department of Labor for workforce development and pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeships. I think we have a real opportunity to really help educate the workforce moving forward. We saw people last year leaving jobs for better jobs or leaving jobs because they weren't satisfied in their jobs. And I think we have a place to play in that space, not just the federal government, but local governments, mayors and town managers and governors. We have a real opportunity here to come back stronger from the pandemic, to really help boost and create the middle class. And as the president said at his State of the Union, push the economy from the middle class out and the bottom up.
How do you do that? We did hear the president of the State of the Union talk about that. And particularly, let me ask about those job numbers that we had from last month. Many more jobs created than was expected. At the same time, real wages were not going up because the inflation is eating into all or most of any raises being given.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to that in a second. So one way I think that I'll give a quick story, supply chain. When at the end of last year, I should say the beginning of last year, the end of 2020 into 2021, we had real supply chain issues. The ships were backed up at the ports. We were trying to get ships in here. And when we dove into what the challenges were, one of the biggest challenges was trucking. So we sat down with Secretary Buttigieg, myself, transportation, and we came up with the 90-day trucking challenge that's creating a pathway into into trucking through a pre-apprentice program. We have hundreds of companies that signed up. So if we're really intentional about our work, we can really move the needle moving forward. So we can create opportunities and we can take the jobs of trucking and maybe input nursing, input mental health counselors, input technicians, whatever you want to put in there. We can create those pathways. Historically, people have thought of pre-apprenticeships as construction, but really pre-apprenticeships can be any industry, number one. Number two, we saw wage growth last year up to 5.2%. In the hospitality industry, we saw as high between 13 and 15%. So we saw real good wage growth, but we also saw inflation. And I think what we have to do is not panic necessarily, but lay out a plan, stick to a plan. The president has a plan to lower the cost at the kitchen table. That was his intention. Some of it's supply chain issues, which is a big issue, making goods now. It's not going to be solved overnight, but making more product here in America for the future. And that's something that we have to do. And then we also have to be very, very focused on how do we bring inflation down. Obviously, with the Ukraine situation, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, that's going to be complicated a little bit here in the short term. But the plan the president had was over the course of the year to bring inflation down. So we have to do everything we can to bring inflation down as we continue to, I guess, revert to a new norm.
I've heard about those apprenticeship programs. You talked about your meeting with Secretary Buttigieg about it in the trucking industry. You've suggested some other places. Explain to those of us who are not familiar with it, how does it work? What's the role of the private sector? What's the role of the public sector? I mean, who pays the money?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, part of it is the government putting some money up for pre-apprenticeships, but you really have to have the employers at the table, because if you have the employers at the table, in a lot of ways, they will put some money up as well. So what will happen is somebody goes into a pre-apprenticeship, they get paid while they're in the pre-apprenticeship, and then they transition into an apprenticeship and then potentially into a journeyman type of job. Trucking can be in a pre-apprentice program, apprentice, getting the hours you need to be able to drive alone moving forward. There are other industries that a different type of model, but you can't be successful if you don't have the employer partners at the table. Because when you get the apprenticeship, people who go into the apprenticeship should get a feel for what the job of the future that they're looking and going into is. And I think in the past, and we still do it to some degree, in the past, we do job training in America and we train somebody for a particular job. And at the end of the training, there might be a job or there might not be a job. But what's really key here is having a pre-apprenticeship. An apprenticeship, it should be generally tied to a company or to an industry.
To what extent would you expect the people coming into these programs to be perhaps just out of high school or maybe out of a community college or later on in their career?
I think one of the best pathways is through community college. I think that there's an opportunity. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it through high school, and I'm not saying you can't do it through a four-year college system. But community college is really best suited to be able to do the training because they have the instructors, they have the history of doing that type of work in the past. And as I've traveled around the country, I've spent a lot of time at community colleges talking to them about opportunities. I've seen programs in place anywhere from nursing programs to solar plants to welding services to aviation. All these colleges, they don't all have the same programs, but they're really geared up towards educating people for the future for these jobs.
As you look at the labor market overall, do you have a sense, a rough number of how many jobs actually could be filled that are not being filled right now through those sorts of apprenticeship jobs? When you talk about nurses, you talk about solar panels, you talk about truckers, how many jobs are we talking about, do we think?
I mean, I honestly think, it's hard to put a number with it. And I guess my best guess would be, depending on the industries, you could probably go from 3 to 5 million people potentially as we think about this over the next couple of years. And you got to remember in the back of our head, some of these folks that we're talking about might be working in a different industry right now that they are not satisfied or not earning enough money for their job. So it can be a continuing pathway into these jobs.
You mentioned also, Mr. Secretary, that something like, I think you said 3 million people you think were down still from before the pandemic, aren't back in work. What is going on with that? I mean, some people are talking about the Great Resignation. Some people just don't want to go back to work.
Yeah, well, I think that the fact that people don't want to go back to work, there is a few people in that category, but most people generally want to go back to work. I think what we saw with the so-called Great Resignation was a lot of people that were working in industries that were, not satisfactory to themselves and their families. They weren't able to. They didn't have a good work-life balance. They weren't earning good wages. I think that when you think about, that's why I think workforce development is so important here in this country and doing it properly. I mean, and the reason why I push workforce development so much is that as in my previous role. I mean, I saw it work. I saw when we revamped workforce development in the city of Boston, we're able to connect people to good paying jobs. And then we had employers coming to the table saying, we want to partner with you to create these pathways into these jobs. And these jobs have different educational skills and different types of licenses that people need and things like that. So we just need to make sure we continue to stay connected. I spent a lot of time as Secretary of Labor talking to working groups, working rights groups, workers, obviously, and businesses. And I think that you can't solve a problem if you don't have everyone at the table.
You have been outspoken in your support for unions, as has the president. Organized labor has driven a lot of the growth in the country overall. What is the role, if any, of unions in the apprenticeship program? As you mentioned earlier, there was a day when we typically thought in the construction trades, that's the way you had apprentices develop.
Well, the beauty about the construction trade program is that it's fully funded by the construction trades and by the contractors. So there's no real government investment there, and there's an opportunity there to continue to amplify those areas. And when I think about building trades, particularly, I think of opportunities for equity and diversity and creating pathways for people of color and women to get into the trades and open up the doors even further. And I look at like urban America where young people don't have that opportunity. So I think there's a real chance and opportunity to make some really big gains. When I talked about unemployment, 3.8% unemployment rate in the country, in the Black community, 6.6% unemployment rate, which is double that of white. The white unemployment rate is 3.3, 3.4. The Latino unemployment rate is 4.6%. And when you think about those two numbers, there's a way to bring those numbers down by creating pathways into the construction industry. In the other apprenticeship programs, I really see this as a pathway. I mean, I think there's a lot of people. Listen, I'm first generation American. My parents were born in Ireland. I wasn't exposed to college as a kid. I wasn't exposed to office work as a kid. I was exposed to construction, and that's what I knew growing up. And I think that a lot of kids that we have in America, their families have been in different industries, and God love them putting food on the table. But to get the kids, the next generation, to the next level of employment, so they can actually become part of the middle class, buy a home, buy a car, take care of their family. This is going to be crucial. I think this is also the future of work, quite honestly. I think the future of work is not just about, what the office makeup's going to look like, but it's going to be how do we make sure, whether we use our high schools, whether we use our community colleges, our colleges, or job workforce development, how do we create more pathways into the workforce?
There are those who think that there are some structural factors that are really deterring employment. Things like lack of competition. The Department of Treasury just came out with a report, I know that said there's some non-competitive activities, such as non-compete clauses in some agreements, that have actually discouraged employment. You mentioned earlier licensing. There are others who say we're licensing way too many jobs, right down to the state and local level. What are the structural constraints on increasing employment?
Well, you could create pathways with licenses. I mean, one of the challenges that we had with truckers is CDLs. We had people waiting for CDL licenses in states across the country because of the pandemic, and offices were shut down, and we created a pathway there to relieve some of the burden there. I think when you talk about licenses, it's important to have, in a lot of industry, have licenses to be part of the industry, but it's important to work with local government to make sure that accessing those licenses is not like trying to, you're not trying to buy a 60-story building in downtown somewhere. You're talking about creating a pathway into a career. And I think that what we should do is remove some of the obstacles we can. I'm not saying you don't weaken the profession. You strengthen the profession by having licenses, and you strengthen the profession by having real strong workforce development. But you also create, again, I don't mean to keep going back to it, but when I was the mayor, we revamped the way we did licensing, and it was a long, arduous process to get a license to remodel your kitchen or build a home or do whatever it was. And we streamlined the process. And when we streamlined the process, we went back to the contractors and asked them how they felt about it. And they felt it was an easier process. To cut down on the red tape, it cut down on the cost for their legal fees. So we can do the same thing when you talk about workers in America. We can streamline some of it and cut through some of the red tape.
When those of us in New York talk about the labor markets, and maybe this is true of some people in Washington as well, we tend to think of it as a national market. But in fact, there's a lot of variation across the 50 states. I know you've spent a fair amount of time on the road. What are you seeing in terms of variations, different labor markets across the country?
There's no question it's a national market. And I think that we have to understand that, recognize that. We have so many national companies. And as a matter of fact, we should have immigration reform and have an international market in some ways, because I think that will alleviate some of the burden. But when you talk about, when I go around the states, it's about opportunity. So when I think about the infrastructure bill, that the infrastructure law that the president passed, I think about opportunities to expand rail, expand roads and bridges, expand clean drinking water to cities and towns all across America. And those cities and towns then can turn their cities around. And if they have good public transportation and good connectivity, they can become regional hubs for business. And I think that will create more opportunities in those regional areas. And so, for example, you might have a city, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. You might have a city that might have high tech in it, and 50 miles away might be housing. Well, you create a housing market 50 miles away with good regional transportation. Now, all of a sudden, you've just created a whole hub where you can tap into a whole untapped resource of people we can work on. A lot of parts of the south of this country, like, for example, I was in Memphis, Tennessee. You think about that, you create opportunities in Memphis, Tennessee, and you put a 50-mile perimeter around Memphis, and you have good, strong public transportation, good, strong commuter rail transportation, and good, strong community colleges in other parts of the country. You can become a training facility for those places.
This Bloomberg program is about the shifting of work, how work is changing over time. You've already suggested one way, at least you'd like it to shift, which is more of these pre-apprenticeship programs to get a lot more people trained up. What do you think are the biggest changes we're seeing right now in the workplace?
Well, yeah, I think the pre-apprentice is more than just training up. Just real quickly, I also think it's about opening up opportunity and expanding people's opportunity for employment. And I think that that's the key biggest part of it. It's educating them on the job, but it opens up their world to a whole new level of opportunity they might not have other had. I think that in the beginning of this pandemic, when we went to remote work, there was lots of conversation about maybe we're going to do more remote work. The future of work in America is more than an office space. The future of work in America for companies is about how do I find employees, where do they live, what are the amenities, and some of those are being addressed in the infrastructure law. Some of those are being addressed by local government. Some of those are being addressed by the federal government. So I really think there could be a real good positive shift in our country for workers in America, for opportunities for better employment, more opportunities to get into the middle class, really creating opportunities and pathways into the middle class, creating opportunities for their families down the road. When you think about what the president was pushing, when he talked about universal pre-kindergarten, he talked about universal, basically, childcare and adult care. That's what families need to be successful, supportive. So we have to think about how do we do all these pieces together.
We talk about opportunities. What about opportunities for employers? Because we talk to a lot of employers who are having a lot of trouble finding the employees they need. What is the cause of that problem, and what can be done to alleviate it?
Well, at the end of the day, when you think about what we're talking about, I'm talking about it from the standpoint of employees. But really, it benefits the employer probably the most, because you have a public-private partnership, basically, that's put together here, creating better pathways for employers to have people that are skilled up through pre-apprentice programs, where they're not hiring somebody off the street that might not know nothing or they might just have a college degree. Now they have a sense of what the industry is all about and creating better pathways. I mean, at the end of the day, to keep American companies strong, it's about making sure they have a good base of employees, that they're treated well, and that there's a good relationship between both of them. And I think that that's kind of, when I think about that, that's how I think. I mean, and listen, if you have successful employers in the country that hire lots of people, that's a good thing. And I think, and they treat their employees well, and they're productive and they're successful. That's what we want to see from American companies, particularly in manufacturing as well. As the president talked about bringing more manufacturing jobs to the United States of America, we need to make sure that those manufacturing facilities are producing at a favorable way, where companies can be making money and employees can be treated fairly and making money themselves.
Is our public education system doing the job we need it to do in preparing the next generation of employees for this 21st century?
I think that the public education system is doing well. I think that we have, Secretary Cardone is better suited to answer this answer. The one concern that I have in this space is the loss of education time over the last year and a half with COVID. I'm really concerned about, in 2020, March of 2020, most schools in America went hybrid, went online. Many of them finished the year online. So young people lost a half a year in school in person. The beginning of the next year, a lot of kids started hybrid. Some in person, some online. So I do have some concerns about that. And I think that's an issue that we're going to have to be watching in America.
Go out 2-3 years. Where will we be in the labor market? Will we be fully recovered from the pandemic, and will we be growing from there?
I think our labor market will be back to work, but I think better than that, I think we'll have a better setup and pathway for people to get into the middle class, whether it's through workforce development, whether it's public workforce development, private workforce development. Opportunities will be there, and I think our economy will hopefully be very strong. But I think we'll have a good pathway into good paying jobs.